The British culture, I thought, was a really nice blend of the pragmatism of the US and the structure and discipline of Germany.
Hello and welcome to the Auto Ethnographer. I'm John Steck, your host on this journey. We travel the globe to bring you stories about culture and the global automotive industry. Fasten your seatbelt and let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Auto Ethnographer. This week we have an exciting guest, Greg Clark, a previous executive, the head of the Americas for the new classic 4x4 off-roader brand INEOS, where he helped launch the Grenadier in the US market and in the rest of the Americas. He spent time with Jaguar Land Rover as a brand director prior to that, responsible for the overseas region, where he had responsibilities for many countries except the UK, ironically, given that he's British in his background. He also worked for Mercedes-Benz in the global headquarters, as well as in the United States, primarily in product management roles, as well as supporting the AMG brand in the US as they were working on their network development strategy. Over in Germany, he spent time with Mercedes-AMG as the director of communications, branding, and events, where he had the opportunity to work in a local German environment as well as with many markets around the world. With that, I'd like to introduce Greg Clark. Greg, welcome to the Auto Ethnographer.
John, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here.
You first came over to the US to study, actually, and you had the opportunity to study in the United States, and from there you launched that almost directly into an automotive career with Mercedes-Benz in the United States. Maybe take us back in time a little bit and let's talk about that and how was it as a relatively young British, not exchange student, but a foreign student, coming to the US and then suddenly launching yourself into the automotive industry in the US?
That was, my goodness, going back to 97, 98. I'm dating myself here, but the origins for that, I think, were far before that time. I was raised on American TV. I mean, for a kid from the countryside in Britain, I mean, America was where everything was happening. So the opportunity to as part of my study path, my program, just to be able to go and spend some time in the US was a no-brainer. But then had the opportunity to study and to live actually in a place which is quite, well, I would say unusual. I went to New Mexico. As you know, John, the cultural differences in different places of the United States, it's 10 countries in one, if not more. And in many cases, it's very much the disunited states. But we won't go into that because that's more a political conversation. But through that process, I had the really good fortune to secure an internship with Mercedes-Benz, who were based in New Jersey at that time. And kind of another cliche, I loved anything with wheels. As a kid, 2 wheels, 3 wheels, 4 wheels, more, you couldn't keep me away from it. There was something about motion and movement that I really, really loved. And the opportunity to work for Mercedes-Benz at that particular moment in time was again, just very, very fortuitous. And I was very privileged to be able to start my automotive career there in 99.
So was that your first exposure to the German culture? Because even though Mercedes-Benz was USA was focused on the US market, clearly there's a German influence as well on how they work and how they have to submit things back to the headquarters. And of course, there are also German expats working in New Jersey at that time at Mercedes-Benz. How was that in terms of adaptation?
It was very educational, as many things throughout my career have been. And ironically, having grown up in England, I had never visited Germany. I've been to France and Spain and Switzerland, but for whatever reason, I'd just never been to Germany. But yet here I was working for a German company many thousands of miles away in New Jersey and interacting with German people. And I didn't have a German boss when I started, but certainly the head of the department, the division, was a German expat. And so, yeah, that was educational. But I had very little work experience at that time. So you don't know what you don't know. And I was just soaking up as much as I possibly could. And I found that the US the US culture of Mercedes-Benz USA in New Jersey at that time was so compatible with the way that with me, I suppose, the way that I liked to do things. I was able to really work around vehicles that were a dream. Um, we'd never had the ability or the means to be able to purchase a Mercedes or be around Mercedes when I was a kid. So suddenly, working in a building surrounded by all these really interesting people, looking out of the windows on a parking lot full of these Mercedes I was in heaven. I mean, what was not to like? And New York City was just 45 minutes away. So yeah, I was extremely fortuitous.
That in itself is its own micro environment or microcosm between the American culture and the German culture. They found a way to work together over a period of decades, right?
I just was going to mention, I found that certainly the Northeast was and I found this since living here a long time and living in different places and traveling extensively, that the Northeast is the most European cosmopolitan, probably, of all of the areas of the United States are found. So, I mean, that much made the compatibility or made that transition for me a little bit easier. There was still this element of, hey, we do it our way here, and there was this cultural tension between a very regimented, very structured German approach and a more casual, more relationship based, more fluid American approach. And they did find a way to be able to make that work and to make sure that was successful over the period of time because America was just such a large and profitable market. So there was the motivation to make it work, and also for the German expats, that area of the world was a pretty cool place to spend 3 years or 5 years, however long they were on their rotation for.
As I remember the sales volumes of Mercedes-Benz, roughly the time that you were there was when the US market actually surpassed the German market as being the number one Mercedes-Benz market in the world. Of course, that's no longer the case now, where basically China is far larger than either of the two.
And I think that does change the dynamic between the two organizations, the two countries, and that dynamic I think is fluid again and is changing over the course of time as the Chinese market becomes ultra competitive and softens, and the Chinese brands gain more and more market share. But anyway, but nevertheless, the culture for me, that very roll up your sleeves, let's get things done, let's work together, with the structure of the German approach. For me, that was the foundation of my entire career, and it's something that I have been able to employ over the preceding or the intervening 25 years, but hasn't always worked. I've had to be very introspective, I think, and quite self-reflective about my biases and the things that I picked up in the early stages of our career and anybody's career. You kind of get formed within a certain mold, and you have to be very conscious of adapting and making that mold malleable over the course of time. And that's been a really interesting part of my job, and particularly as I've gone through different careers and living in different countries and working with very different teams.
When you actually move from your home country into other countries and work among other cultures, it puts up this mirror that you can look into, and it reflects back on you, on what is your original culture and the bias that's attached to that, and you start to look at the world in a completely different way. You realize that there are other perspectives that you can take than what you basically grew up with. I found the same when I was younger.
I think that's really important because then when you are in a different environment, number one, I think you have a very firm appreciation of the environment you came from. And there's a silly expression: there's nobody so English as an Englishman who no longer lives in England. But you see yourself through other people's eyes based on their reactions and the way that they interact with you, and that forces you to reflect on, well, okay, this is the way that we do things, but they don't do things like this over here. And if I go somewhere else, they do things very differently as well. So travel for me, the ability to experience different cultures, whether it be corporate cultures or societies, has just been the biggest privilege and hopefully will continue to be the biggest privilege of my life and now my family, and um, understanding just how wonderfully different, but also how common we are, how how similar we all are, it's just been a joy. And I think it has allowed me to much better adapt to interrelate and to motivate different teams as I've progressed through my career, because I've needed less and less time to be able to pick up on the dynamic of a team, what motivates a team, whether that team be in India or in China or here in America or goodness knows, I mean, certainly the Europeans, all of whom are, operate very differently. So I don't profess to be an expert, but I've been fortunate to have a number of experiences that have allowed me to become more proficient at doing that.
So speaking of that privilege of working with different cultures, you took an unexpected turn fairly early in your career, and you worked for briefly for a Japanese automotive manufacturer. Can you talk us to us a little bit about that? Because that's really a sudden change from the German culture to a Japanese automaker.
Yes, 2006, 2007, I worked for Honda, American Honda, as they're known, in Torrance, California. So I moved from coast to coast. I left Mercedes-Benz, where I was working and really enjoying my role in product management, working for just an amazing boss at the time and a great great team. Um, I won't go too much into it. There was a girl involved, a lovely lady, and so there was some, other sort of personal motivation to make that move. But so it wasn't just a corporate move. I was fortunate enough to get a role with Honda, moving into a Japanese culture, which was fascinating. It was so different from the German approach, the German American approach, I would say, from Mercedes Benz, whereby there were very sort of powerful, charismatic leaders that made decisions and motivated people, whether they are American or German, to a culture that was extraordinarily committee based and group decision making, a very, very clear hierarchy, but a much more subtle and nuanced way of influencing a corporation and interacting with teams. Again, this was sort of Japanese American, but what I found is that the Japanese expats, the implants, had a different role. Their role within the Honda organization was very much to monitor, to steer, to influence, and really very subtly to govern the organization. So I found that the Americanization, and I'm speaking specifically about Honda now because I believe the Toyota experience is quite different. And Toyota was effectively our neighbor at the time because they had not yet moved to Texas. Um, so I found that there was a much greater Japanese influence there. So that was an adaptation for me personally in terms of, as a product manager, I was working with the Acura brand at the time. As a product manager, how is it that I now do the job of a product manager effectively, steer the two products that I was responsible for, which was the RL and the TL, which the TL was by far the volume leader, and the RL was the top of the line Acura at the time. How is it that I feel that I can bring some of the experience from Mercedes and my product knowledge and influence this brand? Because I would do it in a very different way. Very, very data based. Lots of data, lots of empirical data, lots of evidence, lots of market research that's done, which I really appreciated. There was a lot of listening, a lot of research contrasted to more opinion and expertise and experience that I found in Mercedes-Benz. And so for the limited time that I was there in that organization, I found that, again, I had the opportunity and the privilege to learn. It wasn't always easy. It was actually quite frustrating for me in many ways because I knew what needed to be done. And I just felt that, my goodness, this is extraordinarily slow in getting there. But imparted upon me the value of making sure that you were adequately researching and collecting enough data about the decisions that you were going to be able to present and then make, that perhaps had been a little bit light at Mercedes-Benz. And I've remembered that, and I've valued that to this day, to find a balance between doing your homework, making sure that you understand the marketplace, your customer, your competitors in a very clear way before making a move. Now, I felt that the protracted process was too protracted at Honda, and that there is a happy medium in my mind between a more sort of impulsive decision-making process that I may have found at Mercedes and a sort of more protracted committee-based experience at Honda.
Very interesting to basically dip into a much more nuanced culture where a lot of times the message is not the words themselves, but the silence in between the words.
John, I'll give you one example, and it's one that I remember fondly because it needed some translation at the time. And I remember I was part of product management, and there was an expat assigned to product and to product strategy. And this guy I remember very well because he was very strategic. He was extremely difficult to read from my perspective because, as you know, having experienced and worked with Japanese people, that everything is extremely nuanced and is very calm, certainly to the outside. And I had proposed something that I thought was brilliant. I thought it was logical and that we absolutely should do this. And I'd spent time, and I could see there was a little resistance, so I changed tack, and I presented in a different way, and I brought more data, and I said, well, look at what the competitors do, and this is what we need to be doing. And I remember the response. It was very respectful, and he said, Clark-san, please reconsider. And at the time, I thought, I don't need to reconsider. I've done all the research. This is what we need to do. And a colleague who was much more experienced and smarter than I probably took me aside and explained to me what that meant. And effectively, without saying, Greg, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard, he was very polite to say, we would like you, because they never say no. No, we're not going to do that. It's always a much more polite and deflective way of rejection, and being able to read those nuances and respond to them thereafter was I think quite helpful. Otherwise, I would have been such a thorn in their side that they would have just thrown me out probably.
After your experience with Honda, you went back to the mothership. You went back to Mercedes-Benz.
I was incredibly, again, fortunate. I know I'm using that word a lot, but I feel an immense amount of gratitude to people that I was able to develop good relationships with, that I felt, well, I respected a great deal, and that had advocated for me to come back and take a role that was relatively uncharted. And that particular role was on expanding and developing the dealer network, particularly for AMG, to establish a sort of a network within a network of AMG performance centers, as they were called. And this was working very intensively, as you can imagine, with AMG. My interaction previously, and I know you had Helmut Grösser on your podcast a couple of weeks back, and I had the ability and the luxury of working with people like Helmut and his team in product management. But that was Mercedes headquarters. This was AMG. And what I learned over the course of time, that Affalterbach, where AMG is based, is kind of a satellite operation that was primarily engineering, that had grown up very, very separately to Mercedes-Benz and was acquired over the course of time. And so developed a culture which was very different. And I think they really relished being the Mavericks, being really quite different. But when it comes to the regional level, at Mercedes-Benz USA or Mercedes-Benz Germany or Mercedes-Benz UK, wherever it may be, all of these things have to converge in a sales and distribution network. They have to work ultimately for the dealer, and they have to be logical for the customer. So I had really a couple of roles. Number one was the functional side of things, which was, well, all right, how are we going to do this and establish these kind of AMG super centers across the US? The other side of it was almost playing diplomat, playing liaison and go-between between the mothership, as you describe it, which is the core of the operations. That's what's really, really important. What keeps the company running, and it is 99% of the organization. This part of the organization that I was trying to represent and make inroads for was incredibly exciting. The high performance division of Mercedes-Benz, the most expensive, largely the most expensive vehicles, the most powerful, the most sort of audacious of all of the vehicles. And it was something that gradually over that course of time, and that particular period of time, that was more and more attractive, I think, to the mothership as they realized that their image was becoming older. Helmut talked about this in your podcast, of kind of even his experience back in late 80s and into the 90s was a brand that was for maybe a grandfather or somebody who was older and very successful. It wasn't for a younger person. And so trying to sort of blend that, using the tailwind of Mercedes pulling AMG into the fold and playing diplomat to say, well, how do we do this in a way that doesn't upset the apple cart, that makes sure that we are sort of maintaining the integrity of Mercedes-Benz and we're not contradicting any of the activities or initiatives or momentum of Mercedes, but is enhancing, complementing, and just adding to the Mercedes-Benz business with AMG. And I was heard. It's not a phrase that I invented, but a guy that I worked for at the time said that the best way that we can describe it is that AMG helps polish the star. It makes it shinier. It makes it more attractive. And I thought that was a very good way to put it, to try and make sure that we were eliminating any of that internal conflict and obstacle that could have prevented what I thought was a really quite positive project. So that transition back was interesting to get back to the Northeast. It was very interesting from a functional perspective, but it was sort of doubly interesting because I then was exposed to Affalterbach and AMG, where you had to sort of make these two things coexist.
And you were ultimately then drawn into really truly the orbit of AMG.
The thing that I was balancing at the time is, yes, I was getting more and more involved, closer and closer to AMG. I went from leading the AMG Performance Center program to then actually managing the sub-brand. I was managing Mercedes-AMG and also Maybach and McLaren SLR at the time. But AMG was the biggest of the three, was the most interesting of the three. And if one of the most common things that you hear from customers and dealers who go and visit AMG headquarters is, we never expected it to be here, because it's out in farmland and apple orchards, outside, 35 minutes outside of Stuttgart, a long way away from these sort of very large office and manufacturing complexes that are Mercedes. But what they find there is quite remarkable from an operational perspective, because all of the engines are hand built there. They have the one man or one person, one engine principle, where they are just hand built. Every one of the 8 cylinders, the 12 cylinders is hand built there, which is phenomenal to see. But they say, well, I never imagined that we'd have to go out into the farmland to be able to find this place. That separation was effectively, it could have been 35 minutes, it could have been 3 days, because in many ways that connectivity, that connective tissue, was quite tenuous in places. And at Mercedes at the time, the largest market for AMG, there was an awful lot of focus on us. There was a lot of popularity, a lot of success in the US market. I had moved in parallel, I'd moved to managing the brand, but also managing peers. So I'd gone from peer to manager, which was a really interesting experience, and it's difficult, I think, can be challenging for anybody who does it. But particularly I found, because of the US culture, it's a much more casual, much more informal relationship between manager and peer. That in many ways, if you have the right team, works exceptionally well. If you have the wrong team, I think it can work very poorly, because that construct of hierarchy doesn't exist as clearly in the US as it does in Germany, for example. So when I transitioned to Germany, I kind of imported this more casual, informal process of managing a team to the first job that I took at AMG. And I failed. I fell on my face, John. The first 6 months sucked because I did most stuff wrong. And I look back at that time, and I tell people about that time, quite frequently, because what I did is something that was completely unexpected and actually completely inappropriate to the German working culture, and maybe particularly the Mercedes-Benz working culture, whereby I didn't respect the very formalized relationship between manager and team. I didn't implement the structure that was expected, that makes that dynamic work, that culture work, that team work. And it took me quite a long time to sort of figure out what I was doing wrong. And in the meantime, there's some collateral damage of that, because you are the American who comes over from this hotshot market, who is supposed to come over and inject this sort of internationalism and maybe these new ideas and this new energy into the organization. And I think it was probably a huge disappointment for many of the people, until I kind of worked out, well, I'm doing this wrong. I did bring experience directly with customers, directly with dealers. How do we actually get traction on the ground by the decisions that we're making commercially, up at the very, close to the top of the value chain, when you're looking at product strategy, product development, marketing, what is going to move the needle down low? What is going to be palatable to both the regional headquarters, the sales and distribution team, but also dealers? So that was, I think, really quite valuable perspective and expertise. The one other thing I'll say about that time, because I really feel like it was a very compressed period of change, not just for me, but for the organization, because China was growing so incredibly rapidly at this time. And China kind of threw a big wrench into the works, because you now have a market and a customer who is very unlike the customer that you've known for the last decades. It has been quite a traditional customer, regardless of the market that Mercedes has participated in, with some exceptions. This was a status symbol. This was something that you achieved and you were able to purchase as you've progressed through your career or through your life. And you'd reached a certain age. The average age of the Mercedes customer was maybe 52, maybe it crept down to the late 40s, but maybe it was older than that if you look at some segments. All of a sudden, the Chinese market comes into play and grows massively as economically they strengthen. And suddenly you've got a customer you don't recognize. And it's nothing to do with physically you don't recognize them. You don't recognize the demographics. You don't recognize the level of wealth and the motivations, the psychographics behind this, of a customer they're in their 30s. And in many cases, they're in their 20s. And they are responding to things. They are looking for things. They're looking for marketing and image and identity and things that are very appealing to them, that are very, very different to the German customer. They're very different to the American customer in many ways. And so in that period of time, you're also launching vehicles that are designed to appeal to younger customers. The A-Class, the CLA, the MFA platform, as it was known at the time. These are entry-level products. But you have products there that are designed to appeal to maybe 30-year-olds, but you've got the 30-year-olds in China who are buying the SLs and the Maybachs and the S classes and the top stuff. That's so from a marketing perspective, this provided quite a boggle, quite a conundrum as to how is it that you take a limited marketing budget and a product strategy, and you make that stretch, you make it malleable enough that it can stretch across a Chinese market with that particular customer and a much more established traditional market like Germany or the United States. So, all of these things that, I found fascinating at the time, and some things we did well, and, I sort of gradually got into it, and some things I fell completely on my face. But I'll tell you, maybe another another example, which which was again, I learned more. I probably always learned more from the failings in my career, the things that I've royally screwed up, than I do from those things that I think, actually that went pretty well. That worked as planned.
I think that's the same for everybody. You learn from the mistakes, as the saying goes.
Well, yeah, I hope so. I've certainly met people that don't, and seem to do the same thing again and again. And I've certainly met people that probably don't spend as much time being introspective as to like, hey, I could have done that better, because they have a certain opinion of themselves or a certain arrogance that says, this is all great. This is all great. What are you talking about? That was never a failure. There was a particular brand campaign that was specifically for AMG, and it was a big investment that I worked on together with my team, who were really young and ambitious, really smart, very intelligent, clever people, and it was clear the opportunity was in China. The United States was no longer, even if it was no longer going to be the biggest market in the world. The market is going to be China. And that is the market that ultimately did grow to such a size where it eclipsed the United States by some margin. The customer, as I've mentioned, is very different. They're younger, they respond to different things, they're more emotional, they're more visual, they're less about motorsports, which just didn't exist in China. They had no comprehension of motorsports, no real appreciation of some of the, whether it's Formula One or DTM or some of the successes that Mercedes and AMG have had in that arena. So you very much needed to appeal to them on a different basis. You needed to connect with them on a different basis. And with this brand campaign, we pushed it way too far. I pushed it, or allowed the team and myself and the agency to push it way too far into something that, when presented to the leadership of the company, I won't name names at the time, the CEO, you could certainly understand the disdain for what we had created, and that was nowhere connected to the very sort of deeply entrenched roots of the organization and the USPs that had been the USPs up until that point in time. Very mechanical, very engineering based, very motorsport based. And again, you go round and round, saying that the Chinese customer, our biggest market, doesn't really respond to these things. That's not what we need to communicate. It was clear that I was not going to win that one. I was wrong, and ultimately, it meant that it was clear I was going to have a bit of a change coming in my career. So, and at the time, it just so happened that I had the urge to go back home to the UK. And that's the time when I jumped out and I went back home, because my parents were getting older. I'd spent so much time away, and the opportunity came up with Jaguar Land Rover.
Ironically, you mentioned earlier that you said a Brit is most British when he's not in Britain, I believe, something like this.
Yes.
So now you're going home, and for the first time, you're actually going to work in the UK.
Yeah, again, for a company that was, again, quite different. At that time, so 2014, I joined Jaguar Land Rover, and I'd really thought about my career and what I was going to do. And at various points in my career, I've thought about jumping out of automotive and going into a new industry, learning something different. And each time I just haven't been able to make that jump because I think my heart hasn't been in it. I've loved the business for all of its failings, but it is so nuanced. It's so complicated. It's one of the most highly regulated, highly competitive, capital intensive, interesting, emotional industries that, for me, that I think you can work in. And I did consider, jumping out, but then realized my heart's not in it. So what I actually need to do is I need to learn about different parts of the value chain. I want to learn about different parts of the automotive business that I have not lived in. And I've worked extensively with engineering and with research and development and with product development, but I'd never actually worked in engineering or manufacturing. So I looked for opportunities and quite intentionally steered myself into that upstream part of the value chain, into where the first product concepts are developed, into where that is then engineered and ultimately is manufactured before it's passed over to the commercial organization to market and sell and distribute. And so when I joined Jaguar Land Rover, I took over a team of engineers and program management. And this was part of an initiative at that time to expand and to really invest in what they called the personalization side of the business. And that was anything from the most basic accessories all the way up to the most expensive one-off bespoke creations for typically Range Rover at the time. And so, I mean, not only do I have a new company culture, it's a more British way of doing things, which I'll talk about in a minute, which I think is kind of a happy medium between the German way of doing things and the US way of doing things, in my mind. So there was loosely an Indian culture involved because Tata was the owner, still is the owner of Jaguar Land Rover. And there was the culture within the organization, because now you're working on the engineering and manufacturing side, which is very different than the commercial side of the business. The British culture, I thought, was a really nice blend of the pragmatism of the US and the structure and discipline of Germany. The negative side of that, and again, this is me, I'm no the sort of social scientist or anything like that. The negative side of that, I think, is that the Brits have a habit of triangulation. And triangulation is when everybody is participating in a meeting or a decision or a discussion. And then parties leave that discussion or their meeting, and then they talk about what's happened, and they are, we're not going to do that. I think that's nonsense. Or they come out with their own particular interpretation about what the plan is. In Germany, there is no such discussion. In Germany, there is no such confusion because there is discipline, there's structure, there's more often than not, there are minutes, there are action points, and you go off and you do it. Even if people have dissenting opinions, you go off and you do it. Not the case in the UK, which I found. And again, being a Brit, didn't necessarily give me the playbook to be a Brit in a corporate culture. I wasn't sort of blessed with that innate ability just to be able to navigate that. That 4 years was particularly instructive for me, and the cultural side of how things get done in engineering and manufacturing, with very specific milestones, with very specific objectives, and also I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this within the engineering environment. There is a different way of communicating with a team of engineers, a different way of managing and motivating a team of engineers than there would be a team of marketers. Very different. Left brain, right brain.
Like you said, you have the very strong left brain there. And then you jump over to the right brain side, also at Jaguar Land Rover, right? You went over into brand, into marketing, which couldn't possibly be more different than the engineering community.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And for my sins, I probably got back into marketing. Marketing is one of the least thankful or the most thankless jobs in the world you can possibly have, because everybody has an opinion, everybody's an expert, and everybody's going to take shots at whatever you've created. So I think you've got to have quite a thick skin as a marketer. But I definitely pulled upon my experience of working at AMG, because I wasn't just working in a bubble with Affalterbach. We were working extensively with the Chinese market, extensively with the top 20 markets around the world for the AMG brand. And so that was my first exposure to Middle Eastern markets, Russian markets, and South American markets that were incredibly Australia, that were incredibly high potential. And so that was the experience that I had at AMG, and was able to travel and really learn a lot and collaborate a lot with these markets. And I was able to pull on that again when I took over the responsibility for the overseas region. And that really, I think, allowed me to put a blend of abilities, whether they're marketing, their product, or customer focus, all together, and focus on two brands at that time. You could argue they're three brands: Range Rover, Land Rover, and Jaguar, but Land Rover and Range Rover are one, the Land Rover brand. And really look at where the opportunity and potential was. And it was two very different tales. Jaguar was struggling, really struggling badly, as it's continued to struggle. Land Rover, on the other hand, mostly driven by Range Rover, had been incredibly successful. And so you had these two different planets that you were managing in your solar system, that one was really quite healthy, the other was quite sickly. And so both needed to be absolutely supported, and Jaguar's brand equity and its history and its heritage is massively strong. It's just the product implementation and the commercial success was not strong. And so then the ability to work with very different countries all around the globe, where the brand had developed both brands had developed very differently. The teams had implemented the brands quite differently. The customer was responding to quite different elements of those brands, was really instructive and educational. The big challenge at that particular time was there was a very, very dogmatic approach, actually, from German leadership of Jaguar Land Rover. There was an extraordinarily narrow view of what the brands should be, and an extraordinarily dogmatic approach of how we were going to force that and harmonize that across the world, that I felt at that time did not respect the level of maturity or the level of success that the brands were experiencing in different markets. I agreed mostly with the end goal. The timeline of implementation had to vary. But that was the massive internal conflict at the time within Jaguar Land Rover. And then you become a diplomat again in many ways, because you are interacting with markets that are doing, in most cases, their best. We all want the same thing. We want the brands to succeed. We want this to be a commercial success. But finding different ways to motivate, communicate, and reiterate to each of these markets while managing the expectations of the headquarters that I existed in at that time was difficult. It was enjoyable. It was rewarding ultimately, but it proved to be very difficult managing all of those different cultures and different ways of doing things simultaneously.
It sounds then that if you had such a dogmatic approach to the brand, that there probably wasn't much leeway for the markets to make any kind of adaptation to what they were doing in market, right? You had then a very narrow definition of the brand, and that's what you stuck to, market by market by market.
Yes, and you probably lived this during your career, John. I mean, the concept of regional strategy and regional adaptation, or even regional product development. We talked about the M class, once upon a time, the original M class. That was not something that were easy conversations to be able to have. There was a single strategy. The potential success there was about how you actually packaged that strategy and when you deployed it, and how you grew the market and developed the market to such a a point where you focused limited resources, how you prioritize that. Me at that time, I'm effectively the transmission between the engine and the wheels and down in the markets. And so managing all of the power and the influence that's coming from headquarters in a way in which the wheels can manage it, was my job as the transmission, to use kind of an automotive metaphor there. But I remember more about the successes there and about the energy, the enthusiasm, and the passion that people had for the brands at ground level, at the regional level. That in that case, the first time in my career that I've experienced that, where the passion is even greater at regional level than it was at headquarters. And that was just energy and enthusiasm that was accelerant and was fuel for the organization to continue to be successful and weather some of the challenges that it's gone through.
So there is no doubt that the Land Rover brand or the Range Rover brand, they have massive fans, and they've built a culture over decades, right? And the Defender had a huge fan, and that huge fan decided he wanted to build his own Defender. So we can't end this podcast until you talk a little bit about INEOS and how that company was in terms of its culture, because it was a pure startup. And it was a car rooted in its Britishness, ultimately built in France, and you had to convey that to the American market. This is a story I would love to hear.
As context for the listeners or viewers of the podcast, if you wind back the clock, I think to 2016, Sir Jim Ratcliffe, at that time, maybe still Britain's wealthiest businessman, had effectively formed and grown a company called INEOS. INEOS is the third or the fourth largest petrochemical company in the world, and has grown over 25 years, which is a very, very short period of time, relatively speaking, to be this massive organization, turning over maybe $80 billion a year, focused on chemicals. I mean, petrochemicals, oil and gas, specialty petrochemicals. Privately held, very unusual for this company to be privately held. There is one main shareholder, Sir Jim Ratcliffe, and two other shareholders, Andy Curry and John Rees, who effectively run these 36, 37 different businesses, mostly petrochemicals. And as you say, he had seen the Land Rover Defender go out of production. The original Defender went out of production only in 2016. Hasn't been in the US for a long, long time. It was last sold here, I think, in 1997, but was seen around the world ubiquitously. But and he approached Jaguar Land Rover, wanted to buy the rights, the tools, the people, the factory, whatever would be necessary to continue this line of vehicles, because he was so sad. Couldn't see the vehicle that would possibly replace it. That was rebuffed, and being of significant means, a man of significant means, well, how hard could it be? Got together, I think, a very interesting team of people and organizations that have lengthy experience in delivering vehicles, delivering vehicle programs, lengthy automotive experience. And what started off as an idea in a pub then became a project with a few people, then became the beginnings of an organization, which is when I jumped on board. And I was really impressed at the time by the quality and the caliber of the people that they had put together. The very sort of matter-of-fact forthrightness with which they were approaching the business, the pragmatism of the product. In an environment that I just come from in Land Rover, where the product was getting very, very complicated, very minimalist in some ways, but very complicated from an infotainment and electronics perspective, was very much a departure from the very no-nonsense, straightforward nature of the original Defender. Utilitarian, rugged, pragmatic, got the job done. That was the plan for the INEOS Grenadier. And it was, this is at a time, this is 2020. We're still in the middle of COVID. There's an awful lot of uncertainty. People have sort of had this mental transition of realizing what's really important in their lives. When there is this existential threat, there's this thing that comes into your life that makes you really think about those things that are important. And I think for many, in many parts of the world, it of course was family, it's relationships, it's living. And there was this sort of post-pandemic pragmatism. I think people came around to saying, look, we want something which isn't all frills and nonsense. This is actually something that enables us to go out and enjoy our lives to the fullest. And there was an element of that which the Grenadier really embodied, and I really had quite an emotional connection to it and the people that were doing it. And I had the ability, because I'm a citizen of the US, the ability to be able to say, yeah, I want to jump on board and I'm going to come and run the Americas. It was miraculous that the vehicle progressed in the time that it did. My job was really twofold. Number one was sort of the operational side of things. I parachuted back into the US. I'm sitting here in North Carolina at the moment, and a wonderful place that we had chosen after really quite some intensive research about where to put the headquarters. So the job was very operational. Where do we do this, and what do we do? What is the product strategy? What is the timing? How do we make this work in what's going to be the biggest market in the world? The other part of my job, in the politest possible way, was educating upwards. You have a petrochemical company that has no experience in automotive, zero. You have people that have owned cars in anger, in many cases, and I mean that by Sir Jim safaris, navigating to the North Pole, to the South Pole, going across continents on motorcycles and in vehicles, really using them for their intended purpose to the extreme. That's kind of the limit to that knowledge. The process of building your own organization and building your own car with manufacturing and supply chains and all the regulatory stuff that comes into it was uncharted territory. And so what I found, certainly in the first half of my time with INEOS, that was a very kind of rewarding process of going through that together and sparring and debating, well, why is that way? Why should it be that way? Locally, I had the challenge of finding the team. And in one way, it was an absolute dream, because I had a blank piece of paper and I could put together my team in exactly the way that I wanted to, within reason. And I had the ability to then go out and find partners, retail franchise partners, that were going to come on this journey with us. And in that way, I was so fortunate again to be able to pull on experiences that I'd had, lengthy experience in the US, lengthy experience with different brands, and also working with dealers in different countries all over the world, to tell what I think was quite a compelling story and develop a very pragmatic approach to how we were going to do this.
It's an incredible story, simply because, every startup that we've heard about for the last decade has been an electric vehicle company. And this was almost exactly the opposite, right? It's a new classic off-roader, right? It's a vehicle that was very proud of its, let's say, internal combustion engine. Although I know there was an electric version also discussed and shown as a concept car. Branding wise, was there a Britishness element to it? On the one hand, you have Land Rover and you have the Defender, and this vehicle has at least a fairly passing resemblance to the Defender, at least the silhouette. Does the brand have kind of a matching silhouette?
Yes, I think to a degree that morphed into something that was more European, as it was clear that a lot of the engineering base was Germany and the manufacturing base was in France, which was a manufacturing facility that the company acquired from the Daimler organization, from Mercedes-Benz, which was great. That these things were what allowed us to be able to launch in the time that we did. In terms of how that got conveyed to the customer, yes, there were a lot of people that had a very deep emotional connection to either the product or the image of the original Defender. You mentioned safaris and the Serengeti and mountains and these big vistas, these very grand vistas, which really struck a chord with a lot of people that, particularly here, that have very much gravitated towards other brands like Jeep, for example, as a way to get out. It's sort of latching onto that culture of independence, which the American culture embraces so well. Is like, we can get out and I can be self-sufficient and I can go out for a weekend or a week or a month with my Jeep, my Ford Bronco, my Toyota, because the Land Cruiser has been incredibly successful and other Toyota products here as well. So I think the market here was a very fertile ground for us to bring a new competitor to. And you could argue that it's very competitive, which it is. I mean, the competitive set probably sells between 500,000 or 600,000 vehicles per year here now. And we're a fraction of that, a very small part of that. But in many ways, this was the greatest hits. The Grenadier was the greatest hits of all the 4x4, all the off-road products that had come before it, and was a mashup, both from a design and a mechanical perspective, of all these great things. And therefore, it really, really resonated a lot with these people that had used their vehicles for a utilitarian purpose, or had wanted to go off-road and had kind of graduated to certain degrees out of Jeeps, out of the Wrangler or maybe the Cherokee that they were driving, and they wanted something that was a little bit larger, a little bit more refined. I know, sorry, Jeep people, if they're listening to this, we could argue all day long, and no offense is meant. I huge respect for Jeep and Ford and Toyota and everything that they've done. But nevertheless, the market is big enough. There was a space for us, and it was about conveying, who on earth is this company, this petrochemical company that knows nothing about automotive? Everybody has a right to be skeptical about that, and it was my job, and it was the job of people who have lengthy automotive experience to be able to acknowledge that. And I'm not sugarcoating it. It is what it is, but let me tell you why there are compelling reasons that the company is doing the right things to reassure you. That was effectively my job. And for dealers as well, coming on board, there were people that were very skeptical, but ultimately we attracted very well-respected, very attractive dealers to come on this journey with us, that also lent us their equity in their own environments, their brand equity, their reputation, by taking on our brand and ultimately offering a level of assurance or reassurance to a customer that, okay, this is really something that I can be confident in.
It's a really great story. I really love it. I've been following the INEOS Grenadier since the very first moment that it broke cover. I think it was like 2019 or so that it broke cover for the very first time. Greg, thank you very much for joining this week on the Auto Ethnographer. This has been a amazing journey that you've been on, working for Mercedes, for American Honda, Jaguar Land Rover, and then ultimately INEOS, which is something really completely different. But thank you very much for joining and sharing this journey with us this week.
John, it's been a huge pleasure. It's nice to see you again, and really it's been a trip down memory lane, but it's been nice to be able to convey those things that I felt have been most educational for me, and I'm sure there are commonalities with what many of your listeners have experienced in their own careers. So yeah, I'd like to do it again sometime. We could talk for hours, I'm sure.
I'm quite sure of that myself. So with that, thank you to all the listeners for joining in this week on the Auto Ethnographer. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, keep on driving. Thank you for joining us on today's journey. Please remember to like and subscribe to the Auto Ethnographer and leave us a rating or comment. For more information, visit our website at auto-ethnographer.com. You can also follow on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.